Hello everyone. So I just finished Best Served Cold. Best Served Cold is like a standalone book which is set after Joe Abercrombie's first trilogy. I'm going to talk all about it, so if you plan on reading it and you haven't yet, there's going to be a lot of spoilers. If you have read this or you don't care and you just want to hear my opinions on it anyway, here we go. So we join Monza Mercato on her revenge mission. And there is a big betrayal to set off this revenge mission. A betrayal that ends up with her flying down a mountain with her brother being murdered and her lover as well, which is kind of crazy. What's crazy, this is a good place to start, is because that's not even a main theme. Like the fact that her and her brother are clearly in a more than friendly relationship with each other almost is never addressed in the book. It's just brushed over, everybody knows it, and there's no huge lingering upon that, other than, of course, a lot of the hatred comes from the fact that, yes, her brother died, but it was also her lover as well. And that just shows the standard for the grimness and the grimdark that Joe Abercrombie has. And it's the casualness of the grimdark. It doesn't make a huge deal of all the bad things that are happening, which makes it so delightful. And I did not plan on starting to talk about the book yet, so let's go back to what is going on. So Benna is murdered, she is thrown down a cliff, and then she is put back together in a Frankenstein-esque manner by an unknown character. She then escapes, builds her team, her hit squad of misfits, oddballs and murderers, and then she goes to find the 7 people involved in that murder. And there we have the premise for this book. The first thing I want to talk about is the characters. And the characters are always a strong point for Abercrombie. And by always, I mean in the 3 books that I've read so far, 4 including this one. But his character work has been incredible. I can't think of anyone off the top of my head that builds such interesting and readable characters whilst having almost none of them be a typical hero. He does it so well. However, and I hate to start this spoiler talk with a bit of a negative because there's so much I do love about this book, and I'm going to get into that. I didn't particularly like our 2 main characters. And that's harsh. It's not that I didn't like them, I just wasn't very impressed with them, and I didn't enjoy reading them as much as any other perspective in the first law. I think Shivers and Monza were kind of weak characters in terms of readability and enjoyment of it. And with Monza, although she was absolutely determined, she was undeniably a badass, very skilled and single, one-track minded. And of course, such a bad thing happened to her right at the start that it would be a little bit strange if she was anything else. But just how cold she was, cold and calculated, and seemingly uncaring of her own life, kind of made me apathetic as to whether she made it to the end of the book or not. And she was undeniably our main character, but I just really struggled to build a relationship with her. And again, that's not to say I didn't like her. I was just indifferent towards her as a whole, which is strange because all of the main characters in the previous trilogy, there wasn't a single weak one. There wasn't a single one that I didn't have super strong feelings for, either that I hated and loved to hate, or that I just loved to read, or that I wanted to succeed. And with Monza, although I still enjoyed her chapters and her perspective, it wasn't anywhere near as good as any of the other characters in the previous book, which might be controversial, I don't know. I've never read anybody else's opinions on this book, so we shall see. Maybe you had a similar take to me on Monza. And then Shivers was quite similar. I found him relatively endearing to begin with, and then he completely gave up on his own quest that he'd set himself. And it wasn't so much that he gave up on his quest, because I loved the Bloody Nine, Logan, and I feel like Logan gave up on being a great man a lot. Multiple times, and so did a lot of people throughout the course of the previous series as well. But the way Shivers did it just didn't sit right with me. It just felt like he was a petulant, jealous child, and he was trying to force this relationship with Monza, and Monza had one goal and one goal only, and that was revenge. And it just he just felt like a budget bloody 9 almost. And I just didn't, again, I enjoyed reading his chapters. Sometimes he made me laugh, and his take on things was very, you know, Northman, because he was Northman. But again, I just found it really difficult to fall in love with even his issues and his, what's the word I'm looking for? To fall in love with his imperfections, because they were so frustrating to read. And I suppose that might be part of the magic, is that some of the main characters are really frustrating to read. But not to keep repeating myself, but Shivers doesn't hold a candle to any of the characters previously in the first trilogy. However, we do get some amazing characters, and we're going to start with Nikomo Cosca. Nikomo Cosca kept me entertained throughout the entirety of the time he was in this story. He had smooth words, hilarious words in fact, and his utter dedication to being paid as much as possible for doing as little work was admirable and hilarious throughout. If you add on top of that his ruthless streak for those who did betray him in the past, and then his soft spot for Monza, who had actually saved his life previously, you could see that beneath all of the bravado, all of the pretense, there was actually like a decent man inside of there as well. And I didn't really pay that much attention to him during the first Law trilogy, because he does pop up, and that's because he was overshadowed by Mr. Sandan Glokta. But this time round, he was absolutely my favorite, and he shone through. And I think it would have been a much more difficult book to read if he wasn't in there providing some comic relief for our two main characters who were extremely dark throughout. Next up, Morveer and his assistant Day. And Morveer was a very complicated dude, I think is the best way to say it. He clearly had a very traumatic upbringing. I think he was, he definitely was an orphan. He seemed to have poisoned his mother, we found that out. And his self-esteem was massively tied to other people's opinions of him in the extreme. And it's interesting because it reminded me of being like, almost like a teenage boy, where you're so worried about what other people are thinking and doing all the time, because you're just so uncomfortable being yourself. And I'm sure it's the same for girls as well, but and then he just never really grew out of that. Like, his entire goal was infamy, and he just wanted people to look at him for the amazing man that he thought he was. And the best part about reading Morveer was, in some chapters, he seemed like that guy, especially from someone else's perspective. Like, when we first meet him, he seems like all-knowing, all-conquering poisoner who is going to lead him to glory. And then a couple of chapters later, we get some from his perspective, and he's just worried and jealous and petty, with low self-esteem and these strange ideas of egotistical ideas of how much people should admire him. And it's just another classic example of Abercrombie presenting us with a really, really complicated character. Although I absolutely hated Morveer, he's very hateable, he was just a really, really interesting person to read. Day, his assistant, I was actually really upset that her story didn't last longer. I was hoping she was going to be a bit of a staple. I thought we were going to get the apprentice overthrowing the master, but it turned out that Day just wasn't quite as cunning or cautious as Morveer was. He really was the master, and it showed. It showed at the end when he was able to pull off a masterpiece poisoning of almost everybody in his hit list. So I'm disappointed Day didn't last longer, but both of them were fun to read. And what was with her constantly eating? I thought there was going to be something tied to the fact that she constantly was eating in like every scene. Maybe she was some kind of eater. I know there's no evidence that eating a lot of food would tie to that, but I don't know, it just came up so much. And then there was nothing. And that's another reason I love Abercrombie, is because he throws in detail just because the detail is fun, rather than the detail tying to the end. And I've been reading a lot of Brandon Sanderson recently, and Brandon Sanderson doesn't do that at all. Brandon Sanderson is very, someone described it as utilitarian, I think, something like that. Basically, everything he does is guided towards the end and it all ties in. Whereas for Abercrombie, everything he does just seems to add to the richness of the journey and the funness of it, rather than tying to a spectacular end payoff. Because the end payoff is oftentimes not spectacular. It's oftentimes a bit worrying and sad. So two different writing styles. And then this next character definitely almost tied Nikomo Cosca for my favorite character, and that's of course Friendly. Friendly is almost undoubtedly autistic. Although he is a butcher and a murderer and definitely a maniac, he was also quite wholesome, which is strange to say. But the counting, his simple way of looking at things, his need for things to be in order and structured, just actually made him quite a calming presence to read in the book. And he also gives us one of the best lines in any of the 4 books that I've read so far. And I just realized that I will be unable to say the word on the channel because I haven't sworn on this channel yet. So I'm gonna try and keep that run going. But someone questions his dice. They say, your dice are liars. And he ends up saying, apologize to my beep dice. And I almost laughed out loud. It was such a good line. And then we get Shenkt and Vitari. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, Shenkt, but Shenkt is a character that we may be able to believe in. And I don't believe that I'm able to believe in him yet because no characters seem to be just morally in the right. But for right now, he seems to have a good idea. So his idea, from what we can tell so far, and we don't have much page time with him, is anything that Khalil and Bayaz are going to do, he is going to undo. And then on top of that, he also has like almost super speed. And I love super speed as a power in a book. On TV, not as fun, or in movies, not as fun, but in a book, especially when the explanation of the super speed is like the world slows down around them, it's always such fun reading. And then Vitari, being the mother of his children and the love of his life, and they seem to have a very wholesome and very real relationship, was amazing because I really liked Vitari in the previous books. She seemed like a very capable person, a loving mother, and her kids are mentioned in the previous trilogy if I'm not mistaken. So to know how they really met and to know how Shenkt obviously came to hate everybody else in like Bayaz and Khalil's world, like he must have clearly been apprenticed to like somebody. And then also to see the fear on Bayaz's assistant, the person with the mismatching eyes, Sulfur, the fear in his eyes when Shenkt arrived and realizing like he can't beat Shenkt one-on-one. We see that there's a serious player who is going to be going against Khalil and Bayaz, and that's just exciting for the story moving forwards. So out of the characters into the writing, and I love Joe Abercrombie's writing style. I would even go out on a limb and say I think it's probably my favorite. Maybe tied with Patrick Rothfuss. Patrick Rothfuss's books are absolutely beautiful, and it also ties in that clear, really well thought out plan. But Abercrombie's just getting lost in the journey and the conversations and the poetry and the circles of it all. I think he's the best at that anyway. So the conversations are like movie standard, A-star movie standard, and I'll explain what I mean. So we have some lines that are as smooth and eloquent enough to be in a Shakespearean play. And then we have some lines, quite often, normally the back and forth and the dialogue, which are so witty and sharp and clever and rely on each other to form this perfect conversation. They could be in like a Guy Ritchie movie. Like, it's so fun to read the conversations they have with each other. And then finally, the blunt poetry of the stories and the circles within circles are amazing. And I talked about this a lot at some point when I was reading the First Law. He has this beautiful thing that he does in chapters where he'll start a chapter and then they'll come to like an analogy or a conclusion early in the chapter, and then the rest of the chapter something will happen where it completely turns that analogy on its head, and then the last couple of lines with the same like saying or sentence will be used, and the idea of it, the idea that we had at the start of what that meant, is completely turned upside down. And it's a lot of going to show, and I think the whole of what Joe Abercrombie does is he really shows how nothing is what it is. A human perspective makes it. So we can look at things occurring, people, actions, like all of that is completely subjective. It can mean one thing to someone and one thing to someone else, just depending on the situation and how you look at it. And I think he explores that a lot in his writing. And I hadn't written that down in my notes, I just thought of that now. Hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Another thing was the links. So we got a lot of links to the previous story, and although it was a standalone story, and it very much was, we get a lot of links to previous characters and things that are going on overall. My favorite link and my favorite character from this universe was the constant mention, well maybe not constant, but the often mentioned Sand Dan Glockter. Man, I miss this character. He's one of my favorite characters to read ever of all time. He inspires fear, and he's clearly doing an amazing job over at the Union. And I know that the story does come back around to him at some point, and I cannot wait for that. Also, the Bloody Nine. The Bloody Nine is mentioned often. He is almost like a demigod to Shivers, and Shivers mentions him all the time, and he is like the epitome of destruction and despair to anyone from the north, but also to Shivers mainly. So him being mentioned as like a godlike figure makes me hungry to read a bit more about Logan. Also, we have a lot of Bayaz and Khalul, the bank versus the church. That is the overall struggle in this world. And then finally, we also get the King of the Union, which is obviously our boy. And although he is a bit of a puppet, he is out and about. And we almost got him in the story. We basically did get him in the story for a very brief period of time, him and Monza, before he was given a bit of a crack pipe to smoke or something along those lines. And he passed out. So yeah, our boy Joe he's always had a bad time of it, hasn't he? And then one more thing I have to mention is the chapter titled Sex and Death is an incredible chapter. We see so much go down in it, and I'd love to list everything, but I don't know if you have the book on your shelf. I mean, it probably won't mean as much if you just go back and read that chapter, but next time you read it, when you get to that chapter, just appreciate the mastery. And I've not had so much fun reading a chapter as that one in quite a long time. So what are my overall thoughts? Overall, it was a thoroughly enjoyable book. I really had a great time reading it. It didn't feel like a chore. However, in the middle, maybe just past the middle, closer to the end, it got very bleak. And I think this is almost exclusively down to Monza and Shivers, both of their bleak outlooks and how they were going about what they were doing. But most importantly, just their really strange and just horrible relationship with each other. You have Shivers almost hating Monza, hating her actually a lot, his jealousy, and he feels like he gave up being a good person to be with her. And then she is almost got no idea that he feels in that way at all. To her, he is really just a bit of a plaything and something that she's enjoying on the journey. It's like filling the hole of, her dead brother. And it was just a bit horrible to read that period. So, but I feel like it was probably necessary. Like, we did explore a lot of their feelings and how terrible their lives must be. And really, when you give up on any joy and you just want revenge, I suppose that's a lot of the message of the story. But I did find that bit quite bleak to read. So, not really enjoying the two main characters definitely would reduce this book on if I created some kind of list of which I enjoyed the most. But I don't have that. So I did overall enjoy the book. Did I enjoy it as much as the original trilogy? No, I didn't. And the reason why is, well, number one, it's only one book, so it's hard to compare one book to a trilogy. But I just don't think that the characters were as strong. I was so interested in the First Law's characters. Like, every single one of them, I was really engaged and really wanted to know where it was going, why it was going there. And I just wanted them to win as well. Obviously, they can't all win. Some of them were evil characters, but I wanted the story to be elongated so that I could find out more. And it really had some of my all-time favorite characters in it as well. So it's a fantastic addition to the universe. I would recommend it to anybody who finished the First Law. And I suppose that's my recommendation. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. The next thing I'm doing is I'm going to jump back into the Cosmere, so I'm going to be doing that on more of a read-along style. But if you like this type of video, then have a look at my channel. I've got absolutely loads. You have an amazing day.